now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to the World Over Live. Conscience, protection, and religious liberty were hot topics in Congress this week. And what has been the U.S. response to the Christian genocide that continues in the Middle East? Joining me to discuss all of this is a tireless advocate for life and human rights. Please welcome back to the program, New Jersey Congressman Chris Smith.
Raymond, thank you very much.
Thank you for being here, Congressman. Before I start, I need to talk about some breaking news. This terrible tragedy in Nice, France. During a Bastille Day celebration, this box truck run into the middle of a crowd for the better part of a mile. So far, we have nearly 100 people dead, 100 more injured. Your thoughts on this?
Well, I think, unfortunately, terrorism is becoming a staple of our society. We've seen it in the United States. We've seen it all over the world. Again, it's back in France. Transnational terrorists and hooking up with these homegrown terrorists. I mean, it is the ideology, I should say, of radical Islamist belief that is pushing this. We need to go after not just ISIS and Boko Haram and these other organizations. We need to go after the underpinning that has allowed this to happen. And when our president wouldn't even say it's radical Islamists that are committing these atrocities, that doesn't declare war on another faith. It declares on these extremists who are committing horrific acts of terror.
What are your thoughts? Donald Trump has now suspended his announcement. He was to, on Friday, have a big announcement with his VP pick. Yeah. He has decided to suspend that, given this tragedy in Nice. Assuming it is Mike Pence, who we keep hearing is the favorite here, does that unify this party?
Mike Pence is a very strong conservative, a very strong pro-life advocate. You know, people will recall at the March for Life every year on January 22nd, Mike Pence is remembered by everybody. He stands up, he goes, "I'm Mike Pence and I'm pro-life." It's a great line, and it's him to the core. Deep conviction, very articulate. He's been on media like you, particularly radio. He was the conference chairman for the Republicans, so he knows how to mobilize and to work. Good leader.
Knows Capitol Hill. He was on the Foreign Relations Committee with you, so he understands the foreign scene.
If he picks him, he'll be a tremendous vice president and a great asset, particularly in relations with Capitol Hill, to get things done for Donald Trump.
Let's move on. I want to talk about this House vote, 284 to 182 for this Conscience Protection Act. Now, this would protect health care providers from having to be involved in abortions. But I thought this was already part of the law. There's already the Weldon Amendment. Why do you need this?
We have 3 sets of conscience clauses. The most recent and the most expansive is the one named after Dave Weldon, congressman from Florida, enacted in 2004. It's a tremendous conscience protection act. But the problem is the enforcement is vested in the Department of Health and Human Services Civil Rights Division. Now, if we had people who believed in the rule of law in the Obama administration, it is a slam dunk that what is happening in California and now may happen in New York, where everyone is told your health plan must include abortion on demand. The Catholic Conference, remember, this isn't the HHS mandate on contraception. It's not even the Obamacare exchange plans where 1,000 plans pay for abortion on demand. Remember, it was Obama who told us in 2009, my plan won't have public funding for abortion in it. He said it at a joint session of Congress. Did not. It's another one of his broken promises, and that's a big one. But this is even different. These are private health plans that the diocese and the Loyola University and many others, Marymount, have said, we don't want to be complicit in killing babies with chemicals, with dismemberment, and yet we're being forced to. It's a frontal assault on conscience rights. The church has been very strong, saying this will not stand. And thankfully, Speaker Ryan and Diane Black, who's the prime sponsor of the bill, did a wonderful job in crafting legislation.
But President Obama is not going to sign this, Congress.
He probably won't.
So isn't this an exercise in futility?
Raymond, this is the president who went to Notre Dame and said that we need to respect the conscience of those who disagree on abortion after he got his sash and doctorate. I mean, he is now waging war on the conscience, civil right of conscience of pro-life Americans, and it's a global effort. This is part of what the pro-abortionists are trying to do globally, have no space for faith in the public square, take us out, take churches out, take seminaries out, and everyone else, schools, Catholic schools, and by forcing us to be complicit. And it's also in abortion. This is also a problem with those who are forced in the healthcare profession, for example, like the Kathy DiCarlo, who was ordered to do a 22-week dismemberment abortion to assist, to assemble the body parts of a child who had been dismembered. 22 weeks is a very large child. And she, under pain of losing her job, she had nightmares, tried to get help from Health and Human Services, again, Civil Rights Division. They were awful. She ended up, 3-year fight, but this is going on all over.
Yeah. I have to move on. I want to talk for a moment about what we're seeing in the Middle East. Now, the administration came out, Congressman, and they said this is a genocide. What we're seeing, these religious minorities are being laid to waste. It's a genocide. What have we seen in response to that?
Well, it took 3 years. I've held myself 6 hearings on the horrific abuse of Christians and Yazidis and some other minority faiths in the Middle East by ISIS and by others. And there has been a big yawn at the White House for much of those 3 years. In the Omnibus Appropriations Bill, there was language that gave a date certain to the Secretary of State and to the President, declare this to be a genocide.
Well, they did, and they did.
And now the question is, and I had a hearing on this, you know what I called the hearing? What's next? Where's the follow-through? You know, we looked at the providing of asylum or refugee status. So far, it is about 8, count them, 8, out of several thousand who have come into this country, less than 1%, who are Christians. Now, we know for a fact that in the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, many Christians don't go there because they are doubly discriminated against. First,
in these camps, they're abused in the camps as well. So here's the question: you've got 4.8 million registered refugees. Those are only the registered ones in Syria. Okay, coming out of Syria. Given what we've seen in Nice, given what we've seen in other parts of the world, is it wise to bring those refugees into the United States when you don't know who they are and you haven't properly screened and they don't have papers?
Well, there needs to be an aggressive vetting. It's hard to figure out who somebody is even when they present, when there's no background, there's no searching records. And that's why we have insisted that, generally speaking, there has to be a robust vetting or else these folks can't be coming in. But when you're talking about Christians and Yazidis, they have not been part of the jihadist movements, and it's far easier, and they are the targets of genocide. So I have asked in hearings, and I'm not the only one, that the administration prioritize. You know what President Obama's response was? We're not going to create a religious test. We did wonderful things to help Soviet Jews who were in the worst days of the Soviet Union. And my first trip to the Soviet Union in 1982 was on behalf of Soviet Jews. You could call that a religious test, but it wasn't. They were targeted. They were going to psychiatric prisons and to gulags and throughout the Soviet Union. So we need to prioritize those who we know we can get to safe havens, to countries of protection like the United States, and that's not happening.
It has been 8 months since President Obama normalized relations with Cuba. What we've been reading, what we've been seeing, what we're hearing from people on the ground is the political persecution continues, particularly against political enemies. What are you seeing? I know you've had people testify on Capitol Hill.
As recently as this week, I had a number of people who have been brutally hurt by this administration. One of them, his name is Dr. Oscar Bichette, who several years ago, I led an effort to nominate him for the Nobel Peace Prize. He didn't get it, but we weren't the only ones around the world that were part of this effort. He spent 12 years in the prisons of Cuba, tortured. He is a staunch believer in Jesus. He got through it because of his faith. That's what he'll tell you. He's an Afro-Cuban, and he says that this administration, I'm talking about the Castro brothers, they have gotten worse since this so-called rapprochement with the United States of America. President Obama, and the Washington Post has done a series of editorials, and they're a very liberal newspaper, that have made clear that where's the conditionality, as I've said and others as well. If you're going to give benefits to a dictatorship, you demand that the political prisoners be released, that they not be catch and release, which is what they're doing. Many of those who were let out early on in a big show of relaxation, they've all been dragged back into prison. And well over 5,000. The numbers are higher now.
What leverage do you have, though, since you've lifted all the sanctions and you're now doing business?
We haven't yet. The travel ban has been lifted. And I even offered in the year 2000 and a couple other times legislation that said, we'll lift the travel ban if and only if you stop torturing and release the political prisoners. And there are some cases of extradition, like the woman Joanne Chesimard, who actually gunned down a New Jersey state policeman, who we are insisting that she be extradited. She's been found guilty and broke out, in a very daring escape, and then shot this police officer in New Jersey. Those kinds of things. If you're going to talk about normalization, we want the killer of cops back serving her prison sentence, and she's not the only one. And we also want religious freedom. We want to see fundamental human rights. There's no free speech there. You or I, if we spoke about these things, we'd be arrested in an
when
instant.
you have, how can you even, I mean, there are a lot of people watching, and they say, Chris Smith, this doesn't make sense to me. The president is saying it's time to open up the world to Cuba. The Pope came, Pope Francis, and said it's time to open the world to Cuba. This is the moment. What are they missing that you've got?
Well, what they're missing
what are
is
they
that
not seeing?
When you deal with a gross human rights oppressor, and I believe that the Castro brothers and many of their top leadership ought to be at The Hague facing crimes against humanity charges under the International Criminal Court, rather than being toasted and smiled and laughed with and breaking
Saluted,
bread with, saluted. That is unconscionable. These are dictatorships. Tens of thousands of people have gone to prison and have been tortured under the Castro brothers. And frankly, the moment of matriculation from dictatorship to an opening in terms of democracy was forestalled by what President Obama did. And even the Post recognized this. For years, it was the Soviet Union and then Russia that was the chief benefactor of the Cuban dictatorship. They provided money,
that
material.
fell away, yeah.
Then Venezuela provided all of that. They have collapsed. Now it's the United States of America. We have thrown a life preserver to a dictatorship, and the people of Cuba, especially those who have paid with their blood and have suffered torture, like people like Dr. Bichette, they could be the next generation of leadership, the Václav Havels, if you will, of Cuba. Instead, they go in and out of prison, and they're tortured. I have tried to get into Cuba for 20 years to go to the prisons. I went down and met with the ambassador here. They have an ambassador now for 20 minutes. You know what he told me? There's a condition. I have to live within the parameters of who I would meet with. So I asked him, because I want to meet with dissidents.
Sure.
I want to go to the prisons if I can get in and talk to prisoners. I've done it in Russia, China, Indonesia. And I said, do the other congressional delegations that go there agree to those parameters? In other words, circumventing their ability to talk to dissidents? He said, yes. So every congressman who traipses down there now, you got to ask them, and the media should be asking them, did you ask to meet with a Dr. Bichette? And people like that. And the answer will be a big emphatic no, because
they simply don't. They
just
sign
go
away
down
the
there
right
and they
to do
get
it.
the Potemkin Village look about, oh, look how great. And, you know, Cuba has a huge problem with trafficking.
Yep.
I wrote the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 and 3 other trafficking laws. Every year, a TIP report, Trafficking Persons Report, comes out, and we rate countries. The worst violators are called Tier 3. Cuba has been on Tier 3 for all but the last 2 years. If you look at the narrative about Cuba, it's a basket case. They claim there's no labor trafficking whatsoever, and they are heavily involved with state-run trafficking against persons. They got an upgrade artificially given by Obama.
The State Department just waived all of that.
Well, it was the Obama administration, and they can't do that. Speak truth to power. Don't manipulate, the ratings,
the outcomes,
on human rights, especially when the victims mostly are women and children.
Final question before we run out of time. The Hague this week ruled against China. China had been trying to claim dominion, territory over the South China Sea. The Hague says you don't have those rights.
Right.
But what's the enforcement mechanism there, Congressman?
Well, that's a great question, Raymond. There's no enforcement. It is honor, it's rule of law, respect for international covenants.
But China's operating as if this is theirs.
They are expanding in a way that, at the minimum, they want to be the regional power, and I believe they want to be the global power. There's no doubt that they are, their defense spending, their offensive capabilities, much of it has come to the United States, either stealing, by theft, or by sale. We have sold them all kinds of capabilities for their military, which now threatens the ASEAN countries, the neighbors, as well as ourselves. The Philippines are very worried. But here's where having a peace, true strength president makes a difference. President Obama has been feckless, absolutely AWOL, in no way engaged with human rights in China. He just isn't. I chair the China Commission. We put out a very thick, heavily documented report every year that talks about the myriad of human rights abuses, from forced abortion to torture.
And to what do you attribute that quiet, that silence on these human rights abuses? Is it because it's such a big trade partner? It's become such a major trading...
I think that has a lot to do with it, but I think he also does that with dictatorships. Cuba, Tehran, human rights. Where was human rights? Now we have an egregiously flawed nuclear deal where it's a matter of when and not if that Iran gets nuclear weapons, but human rights weren't there.
So you agree with Donald Trump? These were bad deals.
Oh, they were very bad
Iran,
deals.
Cuba, these are lousy deals.
Horrible deals. And the American taxpayer and other allies rue the day that we enabled dictatorship by our indifference to the rule of law issues and human rights. If you get human rights right, you get intellectual property rights right. You empower the next generation of leaders who then get that oxygen of democracy and human rights.
And rule of law.
China would be off to the races. But now it's increasingly stagnant, increasingly belligerent, and we see it in the South China Sea. And it's a country that has scores to settle, especially with Japan and with some of its neighbors, and they certainly don't like us very much.
Congressman Chris Smith, always a pleasure. Thank you for the insight.